The message came in just as the kettle began to hiss. "Lee, about the 40th Anniversary Gala. We've decided to keep the guest list within the family business. You understand, right? It's best we preserve the company image." I didn't blink, didn't flinch. I just stared at the screen like someone watching a memory walk back into the room wearing a different name. My name is Leah Tran. I'm 34. Founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Aria Metrics, a private firm that uses AI to assess the hidden health of corporate empires before the headlines ever catch up. I used to think credentials would be enough. That degrees, achievements, performance would earn me a seat at the table. But in my family, the table was always set for those who followed tradition, not truth. Across the kitchen island, Ethan looked up from his tablet. He didn't ask if I was okay. He never does, he just sees. "They uninvited you again?" he said, calm and cert. I nodded, setting my phone face down beside the mug he'd already made for me, Earl Grey, no sugar. He always remembers. They said it's only for people who carry the Tran legacy. He handed me the tea, brushing my hand lightly. "Funny, you're the only one actually carrying it." I said nothing, because behind him, through the tall apartment windows, stood the building where the Tran family would be meeting later today, expecting a miracle investment from a faceless foreign firm to save their fading business. What they don't know is that Aria Metrics has been quietly buying controlling interest in that very company for the past 11 months. And what they really don't know is that I'll be sitting at the head of that table. "They chose the Carlton Grand," I murmured. "Downtown, Ballroom C." Ethan smiled faintly. "Still want to go?" "No need." I sipped my tea slowly. "We already bought the Boardroom. No point crashing a party when you can rewrite the guest list." He laughed, low, warm, proud, and lifted his mug toward mine. "To legacy," he said. I looked at him, the only person who didn't need an elevator pitch to believe in me. "To rewriting it," I replied, because they thought I walked away from the family business. I didn't walk away, I walked further, and now I'm the one holding the pen. I didn't always want to build an empire. At first, I just wanted to be heard. When I was 17, I told my mother I wanted to study computer science. She laughed, not cruelly, not loudly, just enough. "You're good with words," she said. "Why not law, something respectable, something stable?" What she meant was something she could explain to her friends at the club. So I compromised. I applied to Harvard Law, got in, smiled for the camera, and watched as she framed the acceptance letter like a trophy. But in the quiet, after the ceremonies, the champagne, the polite nods from my uncles, I started coding again. Small things at night, data visualization, behavior modeling, projects that made no sense to anyone in the Tran family because they didn't involve suits, warehouses, or steel. The first real fracture came sophomore year. I built a prototype for a fraud detection model during winter break. Showed it to my uncle over dinner, thinking, naively, it would impress him. He set his fork down, barely glanced at the screen, and said, "Lee, no offense, but business isn't about data. It's about instincts. Machines can't smell a liar the way I can." My mother sipped her wine and didn't correct him, just gave me that same tired smile she always saved for when I talked too much about tech. So I stopped talking, not out of shame, out of strategy. If they didn't want to hear what I had to say, then I would stop saying it and start building it. I quietly transferred from the law track to computational economics, loaded my schedule with AI theory, behavioral statistics, and financial modeling. I stopped going home for holidays. They barely noticed. Ethan and I met the summer after graduation, both working at a fintech firm that thought diversity meant free sushi and a Vietnamese intern. He was older by 2 years, sharper in ways that didn't shout. When I showed him my prototype, he didn't dismiss it. He stayed until midnight asking questions I hadn't considered. We left the company 6 months later and started Aria Metrics from a subleased storage room with flickering lights and a broken radiator. For a long time, Aria wasn't a company. It was a question: what if risk could be seen before it exploded? What if data could expose not just the numbers, but the rot inside them? Our first 3 clients didn't pay us. The 4th paid late. The 5th offered equity. I took it. That company now funds half our research division. Meanwhile, my mother kept sending me job listings from law firms I never applied to. She'd sign the emails with, "Still time to do something real. Love, Mom." I never responded, but I read every line, because daughters like me don't forget. We remember every moment we were told we weren't enough. Every time our dreams were reworded into disappointments. Every time someone we loved called us impractical, emotional, impossible. That's how Aria was built, not on ambition, but on the quiet rage of being underestimated for too long. That's what they never understood. I wasn't rebelling. I was preparing. And now, they're the ones asking for help. They just don't know the help already has my name on it. The lobby was colder than I remembered, or maybe it was just quieter. Funny how power moves silently when it's real. No drum roll, no stage, just you, your breath, and a door with your name, finally on the other side. Ethan stood beside me as the elevator doors slid shut. He didn't speak. He never did when we were this close to the edge. He just reached for my hand, squeezed once, steady, grounding, and let go. I adjusted the cuffs of my blazer, the same ivory one I wore the day we signed our first 8-figure contract. Not for luck, for memory. The top floor still smelled like polished wood and entitlement. Familiar voices filtered through the glass as my mother laughed. Polite, curated. And my uncle spoke with that oily charm that once convinced banks to lend him millions he never intended to repay. They were here to meet the foreign investment partner. They were here to secure the future. They were here to sell off a portion of the company to stay afloat. What they didn't know was that they were selling it to me. The assistant outside the boardroom didn't recognize me. "Ms. Tran?" she asked, confused. "Are you here with Aria Capital's rep?" "I am the rep," I said. She blinked, then nodded, silently opening the door. Inside, 15 people sat around a long mahogany table. Bottled water, investor packets, desperate optimism. At the head of the table, my mother, in her signature pearl set, and my uncle, in a suit 2 decades too confident. My heels clicked against the marble as I walked to the front of the room. No one turned. Not until I pulled out the chair at the head and sat down. My mother looked up mid-sentence and froze. My uncle's mouth hung open. "Lee," as she said, breath catching. "I see the surprise is mutual," I said calmly, opening my folder. My uncle recovered first. "Wait, what are you doing here?" "I'm here," I said, "because Aria Capital doesn't exist." The room stilled. "What?" He barked. "Aria Capital is a shell company," I continued. "Created to acquire majority stake in Tran and Co. through a series of private equity rounds. That process began 12 months ago. The person behind that acquisition, I met my mother's eyes, is me. Silence has many forms. This one was sharp, cold, surgical. My mother spoke slowly, like each word had to be dragged across a field of disbelief. You bought our company. No, I corrected. I bought your debts, your unpaid loans, your outstanding obligations. Tran & Co. was just the ribbon on top. A murmur swept across the table as board members began frantically scanning the packets they had been given. Somewhere in the back, someone cursed under their breath. My uncle stood up. You're not qualified to lead this company. I didn't blink. And yet, here I am, with 61% controlling interest, which means I don't need to lead it. I just need to decide who does. My mother's voice cracked. Lee, this is your family. You're right, I said quietly. And that's exactly why I came in quietly. I didn't want revenge. I wanted results. Something you never gave me the space to deliver. Across the table, the company's head of legal adjusted his glasses, eyes darting between his phone and the numbers in front of him. Everything she's saying checks out, he said finally. She holds majority. My uncle looked ready to combust. This is betrayal. No, I said. This is succession. The kind that happens when the people in charge forget to look at the next generation until it's already outrun them. My mother clutched the edge of the table. You should have told us. I tried, I said. Many times you just thought it was noise. I turned to the others in the room. Today's meeting will proceed as scheduled. We'll be reviewing the terms of new leadership structure, restructuring debt, and assessing which departments will merge under the ARIA umbrella. I stood slowly, gathering the folder. But first, I paused, looking down the long table. My mother, my uncle, the board, the men who once told me my ideas were interesting but not realistic. I thought you all deserved to know who you're really working for now. Ethan opened the door behind me just as I turned away. I didn't need applause. I didn't want it. Because silence, when earned, is louder than anything. The meeting ended like most power shifts do. Quietly, legally, irrevocably. One by one, the board members filed out, some shaken, some intrigued, all adjusting to a new gravitational force in the room. Only 3 people remained, my mother, my uncle, and me. She sat still, eyes locked on the edge of the table, as if by staring long enough she could rewind the day. My uncle paced in tight circles, muttering to himself, half resentful, half panicked. I gave them space, and then she spoke. Lee, I know I've said things in the past, harsh things I shouldn't have, but this is public now. Everyone will hear about it. The press, the partners, the board, it'll look like we lost control to our own daughter. Her voice was calm, practiced, the same voice she used when returning things to boutiques without receipts. I didn't answer right away. She leaned forward, softer now. Is there any way we can shift the narrative? Frame this as something we plan together. Maybe say the transition was part of our legacy strategy for the family's image. There it was, not regret, not apology, just fear of being seen without her script. I looked at her, truly looked. The woman who raised me to speak perfectly at dinner parties, to never question hierarchy, to always smile when being underestimated, as long as it looked polite. And for a long second, I felt nothing. Not rage, not satisfaction, just distance. You didn't want me at the party, I said quietly. Not because I didn't belong, but because if I showed up, someone might ask what I actually do, and you wouldn't have had an answer that made you look good. As she flinched. You were never proud of me, Mom. You were proud of versions of me that fit your story. The room held still. Ethan stepped forward behind me, silent as always, his presence grounding. I continued, gently now. You don't get to curate this moment, not anymore. It happened the way it did because you pushed me out. And I learned to survive in places where no one pronounced my name right, but they read my numbers and they listened. She opened her mouth, closed it again. But if you're asking whether I'll publicly shame you, no, that's not what this is. She blinked. That's not generosity, I added. It's just discipline. A beat passed, then I smiled. A real one this time. Not out of triumph, but clarity. You taught me something valuable, though, I said, standing. That rejection is redirection. That silence can be armor. And that sometimes the best response is to build something so undeniable, it speaks louder than anything you were allowed to say. My mother lowered her gaze. My uncle finally stopped pacing. I turned to Ethan, who handed me my coat wordlessly. We walked toward the exit. Before we reached the door, I paused, one last look. Don't worry about the headlines, I said. The world won't remember that you lost your company. They'll remember that your daughter saved it. I didn't wait for a response. As we stepped into the elevator, Ethan reached for my hand again. I didn't stop him. Down below, the city kept moving. Same buildings, same traffic, same skyline, but everything was different now. For years, I wanted their approval. Now I had something better. Their attention, and not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. That's the thing about daughters like me. We don't crash parties. We buy the building, rewrite the guest list, and smile like nothing ever happened. The car was already waiting when we stepped out of the elevator. Ethan opened the door for me, always gentleman, never ornamental. He didn't say, "Congratulations." He didn't need to. His silence had never been empty. As we pulled away from the building, I looked back, just once. That glass tower. That last name still etched on the side of it. Tran. Funny how I used to think it defined me. Now it was just a reminder of what I had to rise above. Ethan scrolled through updates on his tablet. The headlines were already live. Tran & Co. acquired by Aria Metrics. Daughter turned tech strategist reshapes family empire. The silent CEO. How Leah Tran played the long game and won. Uninvited no more. Inside the quiet power move that reshaped a legacy. He glanced at me. Want me to read them? I shook my head. Let them talk, I've said enough. He smiled. That's the part that terrifies them most. You never had to yell to win. We reached the private terminal, just as the sun started folding itself over the skyline. Our jet, Aria 1, sat on the tarmac like it had always belonged there. Sleek, minimalist, branded only with the soft matte woven into its tail. The crew greeted us by name. Ethan handled logistics. I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything I needed to prove had already been done. As we lifted into the sky, I looked out over the city that raised me, broke me, ignored me, and finally noticed. Success used to look like applause, like validation. Now I know better. Real success is the kind that doesn't beg to be seen. It just walks in, signs the papers, and flies on. My phone buzzed once more. A message from my father. Your mother told me what happened. I didn't see it coming, but maybe that's the point. Maybe I never tried to look proud of you, Dad. I didn't cry, I didn't smile. I just saved the message and turned off my phone. No response needed, because I wasn't chasing their pride anymore. I was charting my own airspace. Beneath us, the skyline faded. The past shrank to pixels. The future stretched out like cloud cover ahead. Ethan leaned toward me. Tokyo in 12 hours. Think they'll be ready? I smirked. They'd better be. I'm not waiting to be invited. Some daughters crash the party. Others buy the company, rewrite the guest list, and leave on their own jet.